Hi, I'm not Jérôme Reboul. I'm Guy Lalanne. Jérôme Reboul is not able to be here today. I'm Guy Lalanne, head of the Financial Sector Economic Analysis Division in the Treasury. And I'm glad to be the moderator of this session on the regulations to support the sustainable funding of infrastructure. So during these 45 minutes, I propose to focus on three subjects that our panelists have agreed upon to work on today. First, as we have a busy financial regulatory agenda in front of us, for instance, at the European level, with the transposition of the final Basel III agreement into a new directive, as well as the review of Solvency II. I want us to discuss first the relationship between financial regulation and infrastructure financing. Second, and it will echo the theme of the day, infrastructure quality, I propose that we focus on the green finance agenda. And finally, because the regulatory questions for infrastructure are not only about finance, and maybe are not mainly about finance, we will end this session with a discussion on sectorial non-financial regulations. And to end this short introduction, I will ask the panelists to stick to the timeline we have to save some time for the questions with the audience. So to introduce this discussion, René, can you tell us what you think what are the main achievements and the main challenges in terms of financial regulation in order to foster investment in infrastructure as an asset class?
Thank you, Guy, and good morning to everyone. This is a very broad question, so it may take hours to answer it. I'll try to do it in a few minutes. I'll talk about the past and about the challenges ahead of us. I think if we look back at what has been done over the last 5 years or so in terms of regulation policy initiatives, the scale and the breadth of such initiatives is just compelling, both at the EU level and at national levels. And especially on the institutional investor side, we'll see that the picture is more mixed on the banking side. I'm thinking, of course, of what has been done under Solvency II, where infrastructure is, as we know now, recognized as an asset class of its own, with a discount on the capital charge which is applied to it. This did send the right message to investors. I think many of them were already quite convinced by the infrastructure investment case, by the infrastructure story, but they needed the regulator to endorse this story. So this has unlocked a lot of capital. And I think with what is happening since this summer, with the interest rates going into the negative territory, there is more to come in terms of capital deployed by insurance companies and the like. We have seen also a lot of reforms dealing with the toolkit that we asset managers have to deal with when trying to channel the capital which is made available by investors into the asset class. And I think it's, and France has been at the forefront of that with many new vehicles which are much more fit for purpose when you're trying to deploy capital. And we are now much better equipped. And just to have an idea about what has these developments triggered in terms of capital deployed, I would like just to mention one figure which can be seen in a survey that AFG, the French Asset Managers Association, does every year with France Invest, tracking the activity of French asset managers in infrastructure funds. So in this edition of the survey, we found out that almost 60 billion euros are under management in the hands of French asset managers, so which is a huge amount. Where the picture is less rosy, I have to say, is on the banking side. Discussions around the Basel II capital charge regulations. And I have to say that it feels a little bit awkward to see that the banks who invented actually infrastructure financing, who invented project financing, are now struggling and trying to catch up in the way they are treated for capital charge, to catch up with what has been achieved in the insurance industry. So it's like the incumbent struggling to catch up with the newcomers. And this is an area where in the discussions we are moving one step ahead and one step behind. So it's a little bit like ballroom dancing with a lot of happenings. It's with a lot of episodes. And it's almost like a Netflix series. So we had episode 1, and these are the CRR1 discussions, which were almost a killer for banks trying to provide long-term financing for infrastructure. And then we had episode 2, the banks striking back with CRR2, with this idea of having a discount on capital charge whenever you qualify as an infrastructure financing. So very much inspired by what has been done under Solvency II. And we are in the middle of episode 3, where this interesting idea is somehow a challenge. So this is very important, not only for the banks, but I think for the whole infrastructure community, because we definitely need the banks to be active in this field. I will end, Guy, by maybe another challenge, which for me is something like the holy grail in what we are trying to do here, is to set the right bridges between retail investors, between citizens, and the infrastructure sector. We are at the very beginning of the road. We haven't seen much effective yet, and we all know that this is probably the ultimate goal of what we are doing.
Thank you, René. Mario, do you want to supplement this intervention and telling in a few words what are the key instruments put in place by the European Commission to support sustainable infrastructure financing?
Yep. Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and thank you, Chair, for having me here. First of all, thanks to René, because I think René gave a very clear example of what happens when regulators and industry work together, and that's the result of Solvency II. I think, as many of you in the room know, that is part of my past. We now look at the green finance and all the rest, but I think this is a very clear example. I took note of your concerns on CRR2 and Basel IV, whatever you want to call it. Let's not confuse concern with facts. Facts, for the time being, is the results of Solvency II, and we'll see the rest. To your question, Guy, I think now the main instrument, the main thing we have done is to offer a very clear methodological framework whereby we believe mainstreamed the fact that the additional investment which are needed for this sort of target that we have, which is the one of decarbonizing Europe by 2050, those additional investment can neither come all from the public nor all from the private. And I think our effort has been, and it was mentioned in the previous section, has been the one to try to see how the public, with very limited resources, because we know the resources are very limited, can, however, mainstream the investment and attracts the private. I'll talk later in the second part of this table on what is the private interventions and on taxonomy and regulation. I'll try to respond to some of the solicitation of Thierry Do. But I think the role of public, although limited and although only a role of initiating and offering a small tilt in the risk return equation is not a role that can be undervalued. I mean, in the 2021-2027 budget that we are negotiating with member states now, we propose to climate-related action a substantial amount, about 300 billions over the 7 years, which means about 40 billions a year. Clearly not enough, because OECD and all the think tank of the world have said what we need is between 250 and 300, but clearly enough to spur the initial investment, enough in the logic of the InvestEU to be part of the machine of what we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Laurent, do you want to add something on Ardion's experience, perhaps with respect to Solvency II?
Does it work? Yeah. Yes, I think fair to say, and René explained it very, perfectly. The point is we are where we are, and I think at Ardian we are really trying to help our clients. You know, we got as clients insurer, but also pension fund, and I think it's very interesting. I mean, having that discussion to understand also, not only looking at investment, that's really the core of business, but understand also the constraint of our clients. And for this, we have defined, let's say, a guideline, and for all assets we are invested in, we define now, we give a solvency report to our clients, so the one who may need it. But I think it's very important to understand the framework Mario was mentioning, defined by the EU, and answer those questions. It's really a question of, let's say, arbitrating between several classes of assets. And for those people, if you don't justify why they should put their money in infra compared to bond, compared to listed equity, then you may lose some of the attraction, and you may lose some of the investment of those people. So this is extremely important for us. What is important also is to be very neutral on that. So we've decided to pick up an external and independent advisors. We're working, for example, with PricewaterhouseCoopers and that. And it's really answering all the need of our clients on that topic to make sure that in terms of cost allocation, they can reduce and optimize what is the cost for them.
Thank you, Laurent. Mario, the European Commission released in 2018 an action plan on financing sustainable growth. This issue is inherently linked with infrastructure investment, and in particular their quality. Could you please present us this action plan as well as its intended impact on infrastructure financing?
The action plan was issued in May 2018, and what is quite amazing is the progress that we have witnessed since then. I'm going to describe very briefly what are the big parts of the action plan. Let's say the objectives were very clear. One was to allow operators to essentially to make money out of the climate risks, because as I said, we need a big amount of investment there, and we know that the economic attractiveness is what matters. And two was obviously to try to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investment. The idea of the action plan was to make regulations that help investment in sustainable assets all across the investment cycle. So we had a regulation on disclosure and financial advice, and that regulation on disclosure and financial advice basically makes sure that the financial advice is given in terms of investment, but also in terms of sustainable investment, but also it makes sure that there is the so-called double materiality. So not only that companies disclose what they do to the environment, but more importantly for the stakeholders' value, what the environment does to them. So that's the double materiality, and what is the impact of climate change, of the value of the assets, because it's on that investment is made. That regulation, I'm happy to say, was adopted at a speed record time of 10 months, which for a regulation. Believe me, I've been doing this job for 25 years. It's quite remarkable. Then we have the taxonomy, already mentioned a couple of times this morning. Let us be clear what taxonomy is. The taxonomy, for the time being, we have a regulation by the Commission, and we have a big work by the TEG, the Technical Expert Group, that has analyzed more than 60 economic sectors and has tried to identify the various areas. I've heard, not only today, but also in the previous weeks and months, a number of suggestions of what should be included, what should not be included. Thierry Daut just said very clearly, a 0-1 is very difficult. We may go towards something more nuancé, so where there are different shades of green, to play the analogy, where there are different shades of green. We'll see that. This is in developing. For the time being, I'm happy to mention that the Council has reached a week ago a so-called general agreement among the 28 countries of Europe. The Parliament had reached that agreement before the summer recess, and we are entering the final phase, which is the one of composition of the texts between Commission, Council and Parliament in a matter of days. If all of that works, that means we will have a taxonomy regulation in less than 18 months, probably. And then we also had something which is very important, I'm closing with that, on giving the ability to those who invest, to those that want to do a sustainable investment, to see not only what is the financial return of their sustainable investment, but also what is the sustainability return of their sustainable investment. So we agreed upon 2 benchmarks. One benchmark is obviously a Paris-aligned benchmark. That benchmark is clearly very ambitious. It's really for those who mean. And then we have also agreed on a transition to Paris benchmark, which is a benchmark which is more progressive and allows, as someone was saying on the previous panel, allows really to make sure that all this exercise of green finance does not end up in only privileging few sectors, but allows for a transformation of the whole economy. And clearly this benchmark that looks at the transition to Paris is very large. Attached to these 3 main regulations, this one also was adopted in 10 months as well. So again, quite fast. Attached to these 3 regulations, there are, for example, the green bond standards for the time being, which have been proposed by the technical expert group and may be developed. Fundamental point of this is that, as I said in my previous intervention, we need a mixture of public and private. The private needs a mixture of incentive. Notice that we are all doing this in terms of incentive, in terms of market pressure and market disclosure. The reason why we can afford to do that with market pressure and market disclosure is because there is clearly in this moment a very high market pressure and market disclosure, both on the demand and the supply side for sustainable product, and we plan really to work with the grain of the market. What has been decisive, and I truly close on that, I believe, has been the political push that the Commission has put on that. My VP, the Vice President Dombrovskis, has worked a lot in the last 3 years on this. He now continues to work on that. We have, as you know, from the President von der Leyen, a European Green Deal coming up. So I believe the political push behind is absolutely essential. But if I may, the political push is there also because we have a very clear civic push. We have the kids, your daughters, your sons in the street marching every Friday, and clearly there is a will there. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. René, perhaps you can tell us how this green finance agenda impacts investment strategies of infrastructure investors.
Yeah, certainly. I would say it's not only impacting. I think it is reshaping the industry. It is really a game changer for the industry. If I look back at infrastructure investment strategies, let's say 10 years ago, it was all about steel, concrete, macadam, brick and mortar, and so on. Today, if I look at our own pipeline of opportunities, when we are deploying our funds, probably 50% is related to energy transition. And what is happening, what is in the making is, and that's something that Thierry Deo mentioned in his keynote speech, is we are slowly moving into the territory of impact investing, impact financing. Of course, not only on the climate aspects, there is also the social aspects of it. And the step 0 is already crossed. Step 0 is, as an asset manager, no investor, at least within Europe, would give capital to an asset manager to deploy in infrastructure if there is no proper ESG selection criteria in place. Where we are now also is investors asking to measure the impact, again, something that was already mentioned, and as a start to measure the carbon footprint. Again, in our example, since last year, we are providing the carbon footprint of each and every asset we invest in. For the time being, this is a nice to have, but very slowly, very quickly, this is going to be a must have. And this is just the first step. This is just about reporting after the fact, after you have invested. The next challenge, the big challenge, is to be able to predict impact. And I'm thinking here particularly about the 2-degree scenario. Yeah. There is a growing demand coming from investors and maybe from public sector and regulators to make sure whenever you put together your investment strategy to be able to say from the outset whether you're going to be compatible with the 2-degree scenario. Are you going to do good or bad to the 2-degree trajectory? Here again, there are different initiatives, and one of them was already mentioned, the Carbon 4 initiative, which, by the way, is going to be presented in a couple of days within the Infra Week. And the purpose of it is precisely to put together a methodology to help investors put together strategies that are compatible with the 2 degrees. And this is something which I think very quickly is going to become a very central piece of any investment strategy.
Thank you. Xavier, as an important issuer of green bonds, for instance, what is at stake for you in the green finance agenda?
Yeah, first, thank you. Thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today. I'd like to start not by our role as an insurer, but by our role as an investor, an industrial investor, because here we are discussing about how to finance projects, and we are doing projects. So really, this is key. And we invest more or less 15 billion euro per year as an industrial investor in low carbon generation and in also in distribution, electricity distribution. So it's very important for us as an industrial investor to be in a position to gather funds that you are providing, dear financial investors, and as such, you're right, we have issued more than 50 billion euros bonds, among which almost 5 billion green bonds, and we committed to very strict disclosure about the carbon emission that we have avoided thanks to these green bonds, and we have also borrowed cash, more than 5 billion euros, through impact loans. On top of that, I'd like to say that we are also investors because we have to hedge our nuclear liabilities and social liabilities, so for a global amount of 40 billion euros. And as such, we work also on some criteria to assess the impact on our investments. So as such, I'd like to focus on 2 points, only 2, to answer your questions. The first point, which is key for us, is that the issuers, and so the industrial investors, be also at the table, and not only the financial investors. Definitely, it's absolutely key. For example, in tools like Finance for Tomorrow, it's very important that issuers be part of them in order for the financial investors and the insurers, the industrial investors, to understand all together how to translate these financial availabilities in impact projects. And the second point, still in my first element, Thierry, a few seconds ago, said we'd like as investors that these projects have lower volatility. Yes, he's right. And we like, as issuers and as investors, that this project or these green bonds and these impact loans be cheaper. So you see there is somewhere here to convene, because lower volatility means cheaper price. And definitely, today, it's not the case. The price is not cheaper, so there is no specific economic incentive to issue green bonds or to negotiate very significant impact loans. This is my first point. And the second point is about taxonomy. And I thank Mario for his words about taxonomy. Definitely, it's absolutely key, because we all know that this taxonomy will have a massive impact on investors. And I think it's very important that this taxonomy be, from a technological point of view, neutral. And Thierry also referred to gas. Gas may be, of course, a transition energy, but it's also very important that nuclear projects can be financed thanks to this taxonomy. Because if we definitely want to fight against global warming, we need, in particular in France and in some other countries, nuclear technologies. This is thanks to our nuclear assets in France that we have such a low carbon emission in France, and this is why it's so key that beyond all these rules and all these debates, we have a concrete look on the impact that we have. And so if we want to reduce global warming, we will need nuclear, so we will need a neutral taxonomy.
Thank you. Perhaps very briefly, Laurent, a few words about Ardion's experience with green bonds.
I think as was mentioned by René, it's really a game changer, and what we are doing at Ardian is really, I mean, embracing that topic, and is really be on the forefront. It doesn't mean like we're very happy finding that market of green bonds, and we've done, for example, with other sponsors, the refi of Tour Bordeaux. And we benefited from a bit less than 1 billion of green bond, which is extremely interesting, because in terms of tenors, we could have found 30, 35 years. So in terms of pricing, I agree, there's no discount, but still, I think it's very interesting product, and product that we need for a very long-term concession. So I think it's very important. But I would say it's maybe more the way you're minded, and I think with Ardian we're trying to be in advance of that trend. Looking at all our assets, Thierry Dehau was mentioning how to measure things. It's very important. Till you measure things and you really see what is the impact, what is the footprint of carbon. For example, you don't know exactly what to do and how to move forward. So this is very important. This is very important also to define levers. Where could you act? I mean, very practically. Sometimes it's very small, but it doesn't matter. It's just a change of mind. So this is very important, and for example, with Ardian, we've defined also at each asset level a kind of contract with CEOs to say, okay, this is part of your job. For example, it could be also with financing, but not only. How do we make sure that we could limit on each asset the carbon emission? And I think, again, it's not easy. But I think it's really a change of mind for all the people within our portfolio.
Thanks. So we had this thorough discussion on financial regulation issues. But Laurent, according to your experience, what are the respective role of financial and sectorial regulations in the sector in which you are used to invest?
Yeah, I think there are two things. I think we spoke a lot about, let's say, financial regulation, what it means in terms of regulation for insurers, for banks. I think we need also to look at how we could find incentive, and I think Xavier was mentioning that also for the investment side, for the industrial, for the financial investors also, and how can we get some value, I would say, extracted for that new mind? don't know. I would like just making some example. We are looking at airport financing, investment. For example, we got 7 airports in Italy. We were in London Luton before in London, and I think it was very important to say, okay, how can I improve not only carbon emission but noise, for example. And what we've seen in the case of London Luton, it was a bit less regulated compared to what we could find, for example, in France. And we had the opportunity, for example, to reduce the landing fee for plane, who could be, let's say, with less emission, with less noise. That's something, for example, and it seems a little bit, I would say, strange, that we cannot do, for example, in France. In France, you get a tax, but a limited one. But if you want to push and say, okay, how can I make sure that I will reduce the CO2 emission in my airport by 30%? For example, pushing the airline to switch to Airbus 320, for example, there will be, I don't want to make publicity, but there's a very strong, I would say, advantage of that. But we'll get exactly the same question from airlines saying, okay, guys, super, you want to get new plane, but what is the advantage for me? So I think in terms of regulation, it's not easy. It's not easy again, but I think we should open the dialogue and make sure that sometimes we got very good ideas, but I mean, we are confronted to something which is a bit luck. So I think in terms of regulation, we should push a bit for flexibility. One other example, for example, on the road, you'll say, okay, could we co-share cars, for example? Could we push for electrical cars? But people will say, okay, what's the benefit from me? And the same, like if you're, I would say, trying to reduce, for example, fees for people co-sharing cars, it will be extremely difficult, for example, with the French regulation. So don't mean it's impossible, just like we should push for maybe more flexibility. What we've seen also, for example, in the airport of Naples, we try to change our mind and to say, okay, what is the usual, I would say, advantage of, I mean, what's the best way to get a better return for is to do CapEx and to do, I would say, concrete. And because why? Because you're increasing your asset value and you're remunerated based on that. And we tried, because Naples was a bit smaller in terms of airport, to say, okay, could we think completely differently? Could we push for digital? Could we push for, let's say, PAX experience, limiting the queue, facilitating, for example, the flows? And instead of investing 50 million of concrete, we invested 10 million of, let's say, new tech and new solution, software solution. In the end, we increased the capacity by 20%, which I think is very interesting, because in terms of reward from the PAX, we had very good feedback. But looking at rewards, return, it is not exactly, I would say, what is the best thing to do for the investment. So I would say I would be also very interesting opening the dialogue, get more flexibility, maybe get some, let's say, different WACC remuneration, whatever, to push for that kind of, let's say, sustainability, new ways of developing, limiting the capex, for example. So again, we believe we get tons of ideas, and I would be very open to start a discussion moving in that, let's say, giving more flexibility, giving more reward if we really embrace carbon emission reduction and so on.
Xavier, according to your point of view, what are the main challenges and opportunities related to regulation in the energy sector?
Well, I think that as regards the energy sector, we need to respect some principles that are not specific to the energy sector. For example, I think it's very important to have very stable regulation, because in the energy sector we need long-term assets. being gas assets, being renewables assets, being nuclear assets, being electricity distribution network or gas distribution network. So you need very long-term regulation in order to have a clear visibility for investors and for corporates to develop the proper assets. To the contrary, when you have brutal changes, as it happened in Germany 8 years ago, when it was decided to stop all the nuclear industry because of the Fukushima accident, of course this had a massive negative impact on the employment and on the German industry. And of course, massive write-offs also. The second point is that I think it's very important that when we enter sectorial regulation, it's important to have consistency between the different goals that are looked after. Because there is always a risk when you enter sectorial regulation that you try to be very, very, very accurate and you multiply different regulations or different labels or different rules that are very difficult, to reconcile. Just some examples about what could be and what are good regulations and which give long-term perspectives. For example, the power purchase agreements that were set years ago in order to incentivize the investments in the renewables were great instruments to foster the investment in this field. Some other examples, contract for difference. For example, we negotiated a contract for difference in order to invest in a nuclear reactor in Great Britain called Hinkley Point C, on the basis of which we'll be entitled for long-term remuneration, 35 years. So this is very appropriate because it gives you visibility and it enables you to invest in this type of assets. Or another example, regulated asset bases for networks in particular, or for other very long-term assets. These ones are also very efficient because it gives visibility, and you can also introduce some incentives in this regulation in order to adapt and to fine-tune the goals you are looking for. The third point is that I really think that in the energy sector, but as in any sector, in fact, you definitely need fair, symmetrical regulation. And today, I must say that it's not the case. We, as EDF, have to sell a significant part of our electricity to our competitors in order to enable them to supply so their customers, and we are obliged to sell this electricity at a cheaper price than the market price. So it's a free option which is given to them. It's a cap to our returns. And there is a great paradox, which is that the CO2 mechanisms have increased the cost of the carbon. It has pushed up the electricity price. But EDF, which is the lowest carbon-emitting company in the energy sector, cannot benefit fully from that due to this specific mechanism, which is called the ARENH in French, on the basis of which we have to sell these very significant volumes of electricity at a cheaper price than the market price to our competitors. And the last point, the fourth point, I think, which is very important in the electricity sector, is that the regulations have to try to set proper prices, proper costs to the different means of generation or to the different tools in order to help investors and both financial investors and industrial investors to make the right choices by integrating the externalities in their decisions. For example, the CO2 mechanism, which is, as a matter of principle, a good mechanism, has not reached yet its full impact, and Jean-Bernard Lévy highlighted this point in his keynote this morning. Or another example, the capacity mechanism, which for the time being is quite efficient, but of course it's important to maintain a type of regulation which gives a price either to carbon emissions or to the capacity that you make available for the whole market. So these are, I think, at least 4 of the key points that are very important to give a clear visibility to everybody in the energy sector.
Thanks a lot, Xavier. I think it is now time to open the floor and take some questions from the audience.
Just one. We're running really behind schedule. Just one quick question. Raise your hand if you have a question. Microphone will be brought to you. No questions for this roundtable. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.